Bruce Shelley, in his book, Church History in Plain Language, dates the Reformation from the posting of the 95 Theses by Luther in 1517 to the end of the 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. While the posting of 95 Theses is commonly accepted as a signature event that launched the Protestant Reformation, in reality the seeds of Protestantism were forming in the church many decades earlier. Several factors contributed to the climate in which the Reformation was formed. Politically, the new centralized nation-states of northwestern Europe were opposed to the concept of a universal church that claimed jurisdiction over the nation-state and its ruler. The idea of such a universal church clashed with the rising national consciousness of the middle class in these new states. The citizens had succeeded in escaping the geopolitical rule of emperors and no longer desired to see their religious life ruled by a single spiritual leader. Economically, the middle-class merchant replaced the feudal noble as the financial backbone of society. Europe was moving from an agricultural economy that used the land as a basis of wealth to a market economy that used currency as a basis of wealth. In many ways, the church was perceived as part of the old feudal system, with its vast land holdings and amounts of money that were received from various nations into its coffer. As society moved to a different model of the economy, the church was left behind in the process. The Renaissance, with its return to the classics of learning, impacted the church as well. Humanistic scholars, called humanistic because of their return to the study of the humanities, used the New Testament in Greek and raised questions regarding the church's morality and practice. People's intellectual horizons expanded as learning increased, and there was a greater interest in secular rather than religious life. Morally, people were angered by the immorality of the clergy and the corruption within the church. The practices of the leaders in the church were polar opposite to the values of Christ and the early church taught in Scripture. In medieval times, people were pretty much stuck in their class unless one served in the church. If you were the son of a serf, you would be a serf for all of your life. But as cities and industry increased, opportunities to improve one's social rank became available. People became discontent with the class system, and they demanded reform. And this demand for social reform carried over into a need for reforms within the church as well. Many reformers used Scripture to challenge the Pope's power and the control of the church as the mediator of God's grace and the sacraments. The reformers desired to go back to the Christian faith's classic source, which was the Bible. In many ways, as leaders and the populace of the church reacquainted themselves with the teaching of Scripture, it resulted in calls for reform within the church. While Martn Luther is credited with being the spark that ignited these reforms, there were numerous other reformers before Luther who paved the way. The call for reform dated as far back as the Cluniac reforms instituted in a Benedictine abbey in Cluny in the 10th century. Following these reforms, several other leaders in the church challenged the status quo as well. An early voice against the Catholic Church's worldliness was Arnold, an abbot at Brescia in northern Italy. He urged the church to surrender its property and secular dominion to the state and to return to the early church's poverty and simplicity. He was outspoken against the wealth of the church and the abuses of the clergy. He was eventually exiled and then executed as a result of his attempts to overthrow papal dominion. His influence was one of the inspirations for this next movement that we take a look at. Peter Waldo came along shortly and gave up his income to the poor after providing for his wife and placing his 2 daughters in a cloister. He enlisted 2 priests to translate portions of the Bible into French. He then began teaching the common people to imitate Christ by practicing voluntary poverty. His followers became known as the Waldensians. They were what you might call an early back to the Bible movement. Dominic Guzman, as he was taking the gospel message to the Albigenses, or Cathari as they were known, realized how ineffective the papally assigned preachers were. Their commitment to pomp and the hierarchical structure erected barriers to the people that they were trying to reach. He discovered his ministry was better received when they went out poor, barefoot, and begging. He gathered a group of men and continued his work among the Albigenses. In 1220, the Dominican mission was approved. The new preaching order we know as the Dominicans were called mendicant, which means begging. The term friar or brother distinguished them from monks. Friar Tuck of Robin Hood lore would have been a Dominican. The Dominicans were also noted for taking the lead in the Inquisition, beginning in 1220 and continuing through the beginning of the 16th century. At that time, the Jesuits would lead the charge for the Inquisition. The Inquisition actually began in 1184 under the bishop's direction, and it was charged with rooting out heretics in the church. While the Inquisition rooted out heretics, it didn't bring compromise or healing in the church. That came through another order composed of followers of St. Francis of Assisi. They were known as Franciscans. Francis was from a wealthy family. His father had dreams of him becoming a knight, but after capture and military service, illness, and a series of visions, he turned his back on his father's plans. He took up a life of poverty and dedicated himself to helping lepers. He wandered the countryside begging from the rich, giving to the poor, and preaching the joys of apostolic poverty. In 1209, Francis prepared a simple rule for his brotherhood. He received approval for his band of brothers from Pope Innocent III. He called his band the Friars Minor, meaning lesser brothers, better known as the Franciscans. Franciscans believed their mission was to take the gospel and the message of poverty and service to the needy world. The administration of Franciscans was more than Francis could handle, however, so the Pope appointed Cardinal Ugolino as an advisor, and Peter de Cantaneo administrated the order. In 1223, Pope Honorius III confirmed a new rule for the order, which allowed for an elaborate organization and made begging a fundamental characteristic of the order. Francis died in 1226. John Wycliffe was an English scholastic philosopher who argued that the English government had the divinely assigned responsibility to correct the church's abuses within its realm and relieve of office those churchmen who persisted in sin. The state could even seize property. His argument was an alternative to two previous positions of the church, which stated, lordship was just only when it was derived from the Roman Church, and lordship depended less on the church's mediation and more on the fact that its possessor was in a state of grace. Wycliffe's teaching links with the Reformation in emphasizing the spiritual freedom of the righteous man, in which both priest and layman are equal in the eyes of God. The personal relationship between human beings and God is vital to salvation. Wycliffe's teaching prepares the way for Luther's doctrine of justification by faith and the priesthood of all believers. The church is no longer the necessary intermediary to God's grace. Wycliffe also called the church back to apostolic poverty. He came to believe the Pope was the Antichrist. He developed a doctrine of the invisible church that was predestined to salvation. Unfortunately, no one knew whether he was in or out this side of eternity. In time, Wycliffe challenged the whole range of medieval beliefs and practices, including pardons, indulgences, absolutions, pilgrimages, the worship of images, the adoration of the saints, the treasury of merits laid up at the reserve of the Pope, and the distinction between venial and mortal sins. He did retain a belief in purgatory and extreme unction, however, though he admitted that he looked in vain in the Bible for the institution of extreme unction. Images, he said, if they increased devotion, need not be removed, and prayers to saints were not necessarily wrong. Confession could be practiced if it was useful, provided it was voluntary and made to a suitable person. The best confession, however, was confession that was made in public. In all of his Puritan outcry, Wycliffe aroused no hostility like that sparked by his attack upon the traditional doctrine of transubstantiation. In the summer of 1380, he published 12 arguments against the idea that the bread and wine of Holy Communion were transformed into the physical body and blood of Christ. He asserted that the early church held that the consecrated bread and wine elements were simply efficacious symbols of Christ's body and blood. Wycliffe led a handful of scholars at Oxford in the translation of the Latin Bible into English, and his priests were dubbed lollers, meaning mumblers. Wycliffe died of a stroke in 1384, and the Council of Constance declared him a heretic in 1415. Wycliffe's revolt would continue in Bohemia under John Hus. John Hus was a Czech theologian and philosopher. His followers were known as Hussites. He denounced the moral failings of the clergy, bishops, and even the Pope. He was arrested and brought before the Inquisition for preaching the theology of Wycliffe. The Council of Constance condemned him as a heretic in 1415, and he was burned at the stake. The Bohemian rebellion refused to die with Hus, however. It developed a moderate wing of ultraquist, from the Latin word for both. They were named that because they wanted to receive both the bread and cup in communion. Hus also developed a militant wing of Taborites from the city, which was their chief stronghold. Each of these reformers was part of a long tradition of leaders who paved the way for Martn Luther through two key challenges that would become central ideals in the Reformation movement. They challenged people to return to the Scriptures as the final authority of faith and practice, and they challenged the abuses and authoritarian structure of the Roman Catholic Church, which ruled not only the people who were part of the church, but often the civic leaders and governments throughout the Middle Ages. Martn Luther would ignite the movement which presented the greatest challenge to the Roman Catholic Church since the split with Eastern Orthodoxy, when he posted his 95 Theses on the church door in Wittenberg.